Thank you very much, Valerie. Thank you for inviting me, and it's indeed a pleasure to share some of the thoughts, some of examples which can kind of give us some food for thought. I mean, the other presenters have definitely given very interesting insights into how communities can be engaged, how much they can be helpful, how we can utilize their capacities. So I'm going to base my presentation more heavily based on the physical dimension of traditional knowledge, which is embedded in the way traditional buildings are designed, and because a lot of them have immense knowledge which we somehow fail to recognize. So I just start with this one example where there was an earthquake in Kashmir in 2005, and many people were killed on both in India and in Pakistan, and several were also injured. And you can see that there was massive destruction because of the kind of constructions which were very poorly done, and a lot of them had gone through number of additions and alterations, which actually led to the, as you can see, the structure just collapsed because there was a kind of multiple materials used over time, and that also because of the lack of knowledge of how to make a good construction, whether traditional or modern. People had kind of, in the modern construction, didn't even put reinforcement in many cases. So of course the structures just collapsed when there was an earthquake. And here you can see several other examples where the quality of construction was very poor. Even the vernacular or the traditional materials were not done very well. And you can see you can have a stone construction, but there was a brick layer added on, and they kind of split apart when the earthquake, with the effect of the earthquake. But when we saw all these damages, there were also a couple of interesting examples where buildings performed very well. And here you see just this one example where a very traditional technique of Dhaji Devari, where there was this diagonal bracing with brick infill, in fact performed very well in this earthquake. And these were traditional constructions that in fact many of these were abandoned. People were no longer living there because they thought that these are not good enough, and so they left them, but they actually survived this earthquake. And there are some more examples where, in fact, even when there was a damage, the structure itself didn't cave in. So you had brick walls kind of falling apart, but the structure was still intact, even if it got damaged. So it saved people's lives, even with these kind of damages. And we also found many other kind of traditional construction techniques which in a way really helped in a good performance. And most of these structures were really not the ones which people aspired for. I mean, they really thought that these are outdated, these are representing poor status, and so we found that many of them were actually occupied by tenants, the people who were working in the labor sector. So, but these structures actually did very well. So, a couple of those examples which really made us think that while these structures which have been done over time with traditional knowledge have performed very well, but people in fact don't recognize the kind of knowledge embedded in them, and would prefer to move to new constructions which anyways were not done in a proper way for many reasons, including lack of knowledge and lack of availability of resources, which led to not including proper workmanship and all in the construction. Moving from the physical dimension of buildings, another thing that we found after this earthquake was and this is also very interesting to find that in fact social networks and religious institutions played much more important role than the formal networks. This in fact is from another earthquake in India, in Gujarat in 2001, and we found the same in Kashmir earthquake, that traditional management systems in fact had much greater role to play in in the response and the recovery after the disaster. So these networks were kind of not recognized formally, but informally they played much important role because they could get community together, they could discuss their needs, and they can even discuss the solutions that they would collectively like to go for. So that's another dimension that was kind of came forward. In the other earthquake in India, which was in 1995, much earlier, again we found that a lot of these traditional constructions, in this case in stone, actually were done very well. And these constructions are called vadas, and they performed extremely well after the earthquake. And not only there was stone construction, but inside there was this timber kind of framing, which kind of helped in absorbing the forces of earthquake. So earthquake forces got absorbed, dissipated, and in that way it was not brittle. That many modern constructions are pretty brittle. So if you are not having a good joinery, then you may find that the whole structure kind of, there is a pancake effect in those buildings. But in this case they actually were flexible, and you could see that there was a joinery which was not nailed, but it had a possibility to kind of move, and that helped in the structure to absorb these forces. We all talk about the base isolation in the modern engineering, seismic engineering, but also we find that in many traditional constructions, the way the wooden posts were placed on the stone columns or stone bases actually helped in the in kind of movement of the free movement of the column. So when the lateral movement happened due to earthquake, these constructions actually it allowed them to move rather than fall collapse. Also, traditional craftsmen, the kind of sophisticated way in which even the stone masonry was done, had a very interesting kind of division of responsibility, and so the quality of construction was very well worked out in the local context, and so you can see that even the stone masonry was divided into these different, somebody could excavate the stone, someone was very good in laying the stone masonry, the other one could carve and decorate. So again, this kind of craftsmanship was unfortunately not recognized in the recovery process, because stone was kind of condemned. Everybody said stone is not good for earthquakes because concrete constructions are better, and so rather than looking at stone constructions, which is a local material, and working with these craftsmen to upgrade their skills, these were totally sidelined, and new technology and engineers were brought in. So what happened as a result was that all of these craftsmen who had knowledge actually abandoned their livelihood. I mean, they moved to other occupations because they simply didn't have a role to play. Coming to the traditional management systems, another good example is from Japan that I wanted to share, where again the community has a very interesting network among each other for monitoring, because fire is a very common incident in these villages because they are all thatched constructions. But the community had a traditional system of collectively monitoring the village if there is any fire. So they had a regular kind of inspection of the village, and the division of responsibilities were very effectively done. So now when they installed water guns, this is a new system of fire prevention, they utilized that traditional way of managing collectively to actually monitor and manage these water guns. So the point I was making here is that sometimes you can use these traditional systems and adapt them to the new ways of disaster risk management. So you need to kind of course, think about what are the new needs, but if there is already a community system of monitoring, you can adapt that system and utilize it for the new functions, new disaster risk management functions that you may install in place. The other point I also wanted to mention, which I think is very important in the case of traditional knowledge and disaster risk reduction, is the importance of the traditional knowledge actually adapts to risks. It accepts risks. It is not always saying that we are going to stop risks from happening. It's not always saying let's make a concrete wall, let's make a embankment, let's stop the water to flood. In fact, the entire traditional knowledge is developed around accepting some of those risks. For example, in this case, flooding is a regular phenomena. So the whole architecture and the planning is done in a way that you are building on stilts, so that you are accepting that water is gonna come, and also because the water goes in a very different way every year. The flood pattern is very different, so you also allow these structures to be moved from one location to the other, because in some cases if the water is in one area, they will move the construction to the other area. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not only architecture but also the planning principles sometimes accept these risks, which somehow in our modern disaster risk reduction terminology or technology, we are not looking at it in that way. We are only trying to resist any of those risks. We are trying to see them in a very negative way, that you have to stop them from affecting, and sometimes these are not very much effective. So this is another interesting example. I've just collected a few examples from different sources that I worked on. And again, in this case, what we found was there is also a lot of traditional knowledge for climate action, which is based on the sensory observations of the elements, whether it's wind and cloud direction, rain, mist and heat. So in fact, we met this guy in one of the villages in India, and he had this kind of observation that he had gathered through experience over his life, and he had been recording it in his diary. So it was very interesting that this is not coming from any scientific data but this empirical data is actually gathered by this farmer himself, and that has given him indications on how he should observe the wind pattern or the pattern of the movement of clouds and anticipate what is likely to happen. So this is an accumulated knowledge based on experience, which somehow we never kind of recognize, or we kind of try to not give attention to it, which I think is quite a loss. I will move back to Japan and just talk about this important case where we had a tsunami and earthquake in 2011, and what was found very interestingly, and again talking about traditional knowledge in a very different sense, that is how actually traditional community systems can help in psychological recovery in disaster situations. Because when people have gone through all this trauma, heritage sometimes, or this kind of total local systems which are organized around heritage, whether it's around a temple. For example, in this case, it's very interesting because this is one of the villages which was completely wiped out because of tsunami waves. Only this temple that you see here survived because it was on a little higher level, and then the community who was completely displaced used this temple as an anchor to really come together, not only to share their psychological trauma, but also to discuss what should be the recovery design, how they should rebuild together. So you can see this lady who is sitting below is a priest of that temple. She is the young priest of that temple who is actually trying to get children together, make stories to explain what happened. Also participated a lot, in fact facilitated the design from the community, which was then passed on to the government. You see, so we need to also look at traditional knowledge in this manner, because somehow we forget about it because we are always looking for the formal systems. So I want to kind of come to the last part of my presentation by just giving some orientation around what does it tell us. I think in terms of the nature and scope, we have to understand that traditional knowledge is not just objective and empirical, but is also experiential. And it exists at both the conscious and the subconscious level. So I think it's important for us to not just always try to look for it in a very scientific kind of manner. Sometimes it's the experience of people, like that person, the farmer, is just very important. It's not static, but it is dynamic. So knowledge keeps on changing. So some of that knowledge which was very viable in the past is no longer viable today because of many other factors. So we need to kind of understand how knowledge has evolved over time. It is also flexible because this knowledge has a lot of flexibility to adapt to different situations, and in many ways it helps us to look at optimum use of local resources, which helps in ensuring sustainability. And the last point, in my view, is very important, that this knowledge is applied and not academic. Because what has happened today is that a lot of traditional knowledge is being documented as a knowledge, but it remains in those books and is never gotten to the application side, which I think is a big pity, because that knowledge will make no sense if it is only restricted to these academic publications. And yes, lastly, it's cross disciplinary. It's not sectoral knowledge. It has many elements kind of together in it. So the problem today is that we are somehow not recognizing, as I mentioned before, people try to be, there are a lot of misperceptions about knowledge. We don't involve local craftsmen, we don't recognize that they may have certain knowledge. So in that process we create more vulnerabilities. We ask contractors to make houses, but then the local traditional craftsmen or the enabling systems are never kind of brought into consideration, and with the result that a lot of these reconstructions are not successful in the long run. And then on top of that, I think the major issue which we have to get through is the fear psychosis, or the misperception that the traditional knowledge is not effective. That the whole idea that this is not something that can be of any use because this is representing poor status. So in this case, they had this whole house that survived the earthquake, but people decided to live in these tin sheds. They are the owners of these houses who decided to live there because they still were not very sure that this house is safe enough. So they decided to live in tin sheds, which become very hot in summer, but because their perception was that this traditional knowledge is of no use. So I think that's a huge problem. And then the important thing is, again, some more examples just to show that when you don't understand the knowledge in a more complete sense, you make changes. For example, in this case, those bamboo houses were replaced with concrete, and the same bamboo house becomes very vulnerable to earthquake when you replace it with concrete because of the soft story effect. So people don't understand it, and they make those changes. So I think we need to kind of look at all these reasons why we are losing this knowledge, why it is increasing the vulnerability of the people. I've already highlighted those issues, so I think we need to kind of give attention to these factors, which are very important for us to really make local knowledge relevant. I think the important thing that I want to highlight in my last two slides is the need to integrate and adapt traditional knowledge. And that means that we should not categorize traditional and scientific knowledge as two separate knowledges. I think it's a huge problem because we either try to romanticize traditional knowledge or we don't give any attention to it. So I think most important thing is to kind of recognize that traditional knowledges are as scientific, and therefore they need to be considered together and not separated as something which is different than scientific knowledge. I think that's something which is important for us to consider, and we need to kind of think about workable alternatives, because I think we forget that there is need to have workable alternatives for repair and retrofitting of traditional and historic structures which may have got damaged but did not collapse. So rather than going for all the standard engineering recipes and design packages, because every time after a disaster everybody wants to go for new designs, new constructions. Nobody wants to think that actually traditional constructions which might have got damaged could be retrofitted, and maybe it will also make more economic sense than going for a completely new construction. So I think that kind of understanding needs to be there, and definitely culturally sensitive reconstruction, how you design a new construction which is respecting the traditional design forms or the traditional way of building has to be there even in the new construction, so you don't create things which are completely have no link to the people's way of life. And I think the important thing also in my view is to recognize cultural heritage not just as something which is vulnerable, but also as a source of resilience. and need to develop innovative solutions that aim at adapting and utilizing traditional management systems. So we need to kind of think about how we can adapt them, as I've been saying earlier, to the modern situations. So there are a couple of initiatives. I just close with these. There is now a lot of discussion around traditional knowledge. Heritage Resilience Initiatives, in fact, was the first initiative at the disaster risk management level globally when we started to talk about traditional knowledge. But now over the years, now it's been almost 10 years since this was started. But Sendai framework, which came in 2015, already brought in traditional knowledge very clearly as an important element to be recognized. But I think what we have to really do now, which is very much required, is that we need to move from what to how. And that's what I mentioned earlier, that from merely discovering traditional knowledge, we need to find out how the knowledge can be applied in contemporary context. And that requires us to really have a very close interaction between research and practice. Because innovation is needed for adapting traditional knowledge to contemporary context. So that is something which we need to work on. And I conclude with this last slide, where I wanted to just mention this work that we are doing at ICRAM with the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. There is this guide which is called Words into Action Guide for Sendai Framework on using traditional knowledge for disaster risk reduction. So the whole idea about this guide, which is now in its final stage of publication, is that it will tell decision makers, professionals who are involved in disaster risk reduction and recovery to see how you can actually use traditional knowledge rather than just understanding what the knowledge in it is. Because I think we have enough to say that there is a lot of knowledge, but I think we need to work now on actually making it useful in practical terms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rohit. We have a question for you, which I think is a question actually possibly that also Viviana might have some opinions on, but we'll start with Rohit. The question is, sorry, I have to read this. When money as a means of exchange drops, I guess in crisis situations, how do communities, from your experience, organise to make more effective use of limited resources? And what could we learn for potential replication and scaling?
Yeah. Yes, there is enough evidence to show that communities organize very well with limited resources, and in situations where there are a lot of kind of already limitations or constraints. But I feel like the gap lies in the fact that those who are coming to support from outside are completely disconnected from these local initiatives. So what happens is that these bottom-up initiatives, which are very indigenous, which are based on the local accumulated experience, don't connect very well with the experience that is kind of transferred from outside, and in that process, I think we lose out. What I feel is needed is a very important role of a facilitator who enables this kind of cross-pollination of the local initiatives and the outside experience, external experience and the knowledge, because that doesn't happen, and in that process we are not able to kind of build on both, So that would be my response to your question.